The brutal Wyoming winter had Harold Finch pinned, his rifle lost in the snow, a ravenous cougar lunging for his throat. His old hip screamed, his breath hitched. Just as the cougar prepared to pounce, a shadow burst from the pines. It was the pack leader, a massive gray wolf, eyes like amber fire, planting itself between Harold and certain death, its low growl a primal challenge to the hungry beast. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The Wyoming wind howled like a hungry spirit, biting through Harold Finch's worn canvas coat, straight to his bones. At 78, every step across the snow-covered wilderness was a deliberate, painful effort. His hip, an old injury that flared in the deep cold, throbbed with a dull ache, slowing his return to the cabin. He was tired, hungry, and the setting sun was painting the sky in fiery oranges, a beautiful but grim reminder of the rapidly dropping temperatures. He pulled his knitted cap lower, hunching his shoulders against the swirling flakes. Harold had lived in these remote wilds for decades, a solitary trapper in his hand-built log cabin, miles from any other human. It was a hard life, but his. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, and its fleeting moments of unexpected grace. He remembered one such moment, 10 years ago, a day that had changed something deep within him, something others just couldn't understand. He'd been checking his trap lines when he found it, a young gray wolf, no more than a year old, caught in one of his own steel jaws. Its front left paw was mangled, crushed, and bleeding, a gruesome sight. The wolf lay there, panting, its eyes, a fierce, intelligent amber, fixed on him not with fear alone, but with a raw, desperate will to live. Most trappers would have simply dispatched it quickly. Wolves were competition, after all, a threat. But something in that young wolf's gaze, its sheer tenacity, resonated with Harold. He couldn't kill a creature so young, so full of fight, not when his own device had caused its suffering. It was a personal defiance against the wilderness's harsh code. Carefully, meticulously, he worked the trap open, freeing the young wolf. He tended its paw with what little he had, then left fresh game scraps and water nearby. He named it Gray Paw in his mind, for its distinctive coat and injured limb. For several days, Harold watched from a respectful distance as Gray Paw tentatively accepted his offerings, slowly, miraculously, beginning to heal. There was no taming, no gentle touch, but a silent understanding was born. Before it finally melted back into the deeper wilderness, the young wolf paused, turning its head, its eyes meeting Harold's. It was a wordless acknowledgement etched into his memory, a secret shared. Of course, when he mentioned it to the other trappers, Clifford Weston, younger and always looking for an edge, just scoffed. "Saving a wolf, Harold? You're going soft, old man. They're vermin, not pets." Murray Bates, a grizzled old-timer, simply shook his head. "Foolish sentimentality, Harold. You'll lose your edge out here." They saw it as weakness, but Harold didn't care. He knew what he'd done, and it felt right. Over the years, that silent understanding deepened into an unspoken, mutual respect. Harold would occasionally catch sight of a magnificent gray wolf, clearly the pack leader, watching from a ridge or through the pines. That familiar, faint limp was there, almost imperceptible to anyone else. They would share brief, intense glances, a recognition passing, before the wolf would disappear. Harold sometimes left leftover game at his property's edge, a quiet offering. He never expected reciprocation, but the wolf pack's territory seemed to intersect with his, yet they always kept a respectful distance, never disturbing his traps or cabin. It was a unique, quiet communion in the vast wild, a silent acknowledgement across species. But tonight, logic was a luxury Harold couldn't afford. The cold was unbearable, the hunger a gnawing beast in his gut. His hip was screaming now, a sharp, searing pain with every step. He was so close to his cabin, just a few hundred yards. He pushed himself forward, his boot catching on an ice-covered rock. His arms flailed uselessly, his old lever-action rifle slipping from his numb fingers and burying itself in a snowdrift. He crashed down hard, a groan escaping his lips as his bad hip took the brunt of the fall, pinning him awkwardly between a snow-covered log and the frozen ground. Then, from the pristine white stillness, a blur of tawny fur erupted. A massive male cougar, driven to desperation by the brutal winter's scarcity of prey, launched itself from a snowdrift, its guttural snarl ripping through the silence. Its eyes, twin lamps of pure, ravenous hunger, were locked on Harold. He tried to scramble, to reach for his rifle, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped, helpless, the cougar's powerful form already coiling to pounce, its breath hot on the freezing air. Harold squeezed his eyes shut, the feral scent of the cougar thick and overwhelming. He could feel the big cat's weight, its predatory heat, even before it touched him. A low, rumbling snarl vibrated through the air, inches from his face. This was it, he thought. A life lived hard in the wilderness, ending just as hard. Then, a sound that ripped through the cold, biting wind. A deep, resonant howl, full of raw authority, echoing through the snow-laden pines. It wasn't the shriek of a cougar, but something far more ancient, more powerful. The cougar froze, its head snapping up, ears swiveling. Moments later, a blur of gray fur erupted from the tree line. It was the pack leader, massive and formidable, its amber eyes burning with an intensity Harold remembered so well. Behind it, two other large wolves, dark shadows against the white snow, burst into the clearing. The pack leader, Gray Paw, as Harold had once called it, didn't hesitate. It moved with astonishing speed, planting itself directly between Harold and the cougar, a formidable, living barrier. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in its chest, a challenge that filled the frigid air. The two other wolves circled, agile and silent, nipping at the cougar's flanks, harrying the larger cat from behind. The cougar, taken by surprise, hissed, swiveling its head, its focus momentarily divided. It was a hunter, used to being the apex predator, not the hunted. Gray Paw, with a ferocity that startled Harold, lunged. It wasn't a reckless charge, but a calculated, brutal engagement, a blur of gray fur and powerful jaws. The cougar lashed out instinctively, a lightning-fast rake of its claws. 3 raw, deep claw marks tore across Gray Paw's right flank, instantly bleeding sluggishly into its thick fur. The cougar's jaws snapped, catching Gray Paw on the shoulder, leaving a ragged bite mark. But the pack leader held its ground, snarling defiance, its jaws snapping back, driving the cougar back from Harold. The relentless, synchronized pressure from the 3 wolves was too much. The cougar, outnumbered and now bleeding, had a choice. Continue a losing battle against these determined wolves or retreat. It snarled again, a sound of frustration and fury, but the wolves gave it no quarter. Harold, watching in stunned disbelief, realized this was his chance. He struggled, pushing against the heavy log, his hip screaming in protest, but adrenaline coursed through him. He finally wrestled himself free, scrambling toward where his rifle had fallen, his fingers numb as he fumbled for the cold metal. With a final, furious glance at Harold and the wolves, the cougar broke off the attack. It bounded away into the deeper, dark timber, disappearing like a ghost, its tawny form melting into the shadows of the lodgepole pines. Gray Paw, though clearly wounded, stood over Harold for a long, silent moment. Its chest heaved, hot breath steaming in the cold air. The raw claw marks on its flank bled, and the bite on its shoulder glistened darkly. The old, faint limp in its left front paw was now pronounced, as it favored the injured limb from the strain of the brutal confrontation. Its piercing amber eyes met Harold's, a deep, knowing understanding passing between them. Harold, shaken and winded, managed a slow, grateful nod. With another soft, almost imperceptible nod of its massive head, the pack leader gathered its 2 pack members. It turned, and with a noticeable limp, disappeared back into the snowy forest, leaving Harold alone but undeniably saved. Harold finally stumbled through the door of his cabin, the cold stinging his lungs, the taste of fear still metallic on his tongue. He leaned his retrieved rifle against the wall, then sank onto a rough-hewn stool by the crackling fire, his old hip throbbing with a fierce, relentless ache. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him, a stark contrast to the primal roars and snarls that had just filled the air outside. The faces of Clifford Weston and Murray Bates, etched with a stunned, almost reverent silence, flashed in his mind. They had arrived on their snowmobiles, their faces grim, expecting to find a tragedy. Instead, they found Harold, pale and shaken, but alive. He'd shown them the cougar tracks, clear and deep in the fresh snow, leading right to the cabin, and then, just beyond them, the unmistakable imprints of massive wolf paws heading back into the timber. He'd recounted the impossible defense, his voice hoarse with shock and a profound gratitude. Their usual scoffing had been replaced by a quiet, unseeing respect. They had left, wordless, their skepticism utterly shattered. Now, alone in the warmth of his small cabin, Harold's mind replayed every terrifying second. He could still see the pack leader, Gray Paw, placing itself between him and the ravenous cougar. He remembered the blur of gray fur, the swift, savage clash, the blood blooming dark on the wolf's flank and shoulder. He pictured the faint limp, now pronounced, as the wolf turned and disappeared back into the forest, its duty done. Harold had lived a long, hard life in these mountains. He'd seen much, endured more. But he had never witnessed anything quite like that. A decade ago, he'd offered a simple act of mercy, a kindness against all the pragmatic wisdom of the wilderness. He never expected anything in return. Yet, the wilderness had remembered. The wolf had remembered. For the next few days, Harold moved slowly, gingerly. His hip was a constant, dull throb, a physical reminder of how close he'd come to the edge. He spent most of his time by the fire, nursing a mug of strong, bitter coffee, staring out the window at the snow-covered pines. He imagined Gray Paw, back with its pack, somewhere out in the vast, unforgiving expanse, licking its wounds, leading its family through the relentless winter. He hoped it was recovering, that its injuries weren't too severe. It was a king in its domain, a veteran of countless hunts and brutal winters, and now a silent savior. It deserved to rest, to heal, to continue its reign. The daily ritual of checking his traps felt too much for him now, even if the thought of leaving fresh game scraps out for the wolves remained. He knew they'd find their own way. The world outside, usually a place of stark survival, now held a new, almost sacred meaning. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every distant howl, every shadow that shifted in the tree line seemed to carry a silent message, a quiet reassurance. Harold had always respected the wilderness, but now he felt a part of something deeper, something that transcended the simple give and take of predator and prey. He had touched the heart of the wild, and it had touched his in return. The brutal winter still raged, but Harold felt a warmth in his chest that the fiercest fire couldn't provide. Years had turned the young, injured Gray Paw into the pack leader, a magnificent creature of muscle and stealth, king of its harsh domain. For Harold Finch, the intervening decade wasn't just a passage of time. It was a slow, quiet weaving of an unbreakable thread between man and wolf. It was a bond forged in silent moments in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Wyoming wilderness. Harold rarely saw Gray Paw up close anymore, not like those early days by the trap. But he saw it. He saw the pack leader at a distance, a ghost of gray against the snow, perched on a ridge overlooking his cabin or slipping through the dense lodgepole pines on the far side of the frozen creek. Sometimes he'd just catch a fleeting glimpse, a flicker of movement, a keen pair of amber eyes watching him from the shadows, eyes that held a knowing intelligence, a silent acknowledgement. And always, Harold noticed, that faint, subtle limp in its front left paw. 10 years later, it was still there, a ghost of the past, a silent testament to their shared history. Only Harold would likely ever notice it, a detail that deepened the secret understanding between them. He would be out checking his snares, the biting wind whipping snow into his face, his worn leather gloves stiff with cold. He'd pause by a gnarled pine, its branches heavy with snow, and scan the horizon. And there, sometimes, would be the pack leader, still and watchful, its coat a perfect camouflage against the winter landscape. Harold never raised his rifle, never made a sudden move. He'd simply hold still, sometimes for long minutes, and let his gaze meet the wolf's. In those moments, the biting cold would recede. The vastness of the wilderness would shrink to just the two of them, and a profound, quiet understanding would pass between them. It wasn't about friendship in the human sense, not about petting or loyalty. It was about respect, about a shared knowing of the wild, and an acknowledgement of a debt, freely given and, it seemed, silently accepted. "Still out there, eh, old friend?" Harold would sometimes whisper, the words barely audible over the wind, knowing no human ear would ever hear him. "You've done good, Gray Paw. A real leader." He would never expect a reply, only the continued, steady gaze of those intelligent amber eyes before the wolf would turn, without a sound, and melt back into the shadows, becoming one with the wilderness once more. Harold would often leave leftover game at the edge of his property, not directly at his cabin door, but a respectful distance away, near the old, hollowed-out stump where he knew the pack sometimes passed. A piece of deer, a rabbit, never anything processed, just raw meat, a quiet offering. He never saw them take it, but the next morning, it would be gone. It wasn't a gesture of taming, but a continuation of that silent agreement, a quiet offering in a world where every creature had to fight for its survival. He knew the pack thrived, that Gray Paw had become an undisputed leader, its presence a powerful, almost spiritual anchor in the wilderness that surrounded his isolated cabin. The wolf pack never disturbed his traps. They never ventured too close to his cabin, always maintaining a respectful distance. It was a unique, quiet communion in the vast wild, a silent acknowledgement across the species barrier that transcended words. It was the knowledge that somewhere out there, among the howling winds and snow-laden trees, was a creature he had saved, a creature that remembered. And Harold, in his solitary existence, found a quiet comfort in that, a connection that few men ever experienced. He was alone, but never truly alone. Not when Gray Paw, the pack leader, roamed these mountains. The Wyoming wind howled like a hungry spirit, biting through Harold Finch's worn canvas coat, straight to his bones. At 78, every step across the snow-covered wilderness was a deliberate, painful effort. His hip, An old injury that flared in the deep cold throbbed with a dull, insistent ache, slowing his return to the cabin. He was tired, bone-weary after a long day checking his traps, and his stomach rumbled with a hunger that felt more like an empty cavern. The setting sun had already dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the western sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, a beautiful but grim reminder of the rapidly dropping temperatures. He pulled his knitted cap lower, hunching his shoulders against the swirling flakes, just wishing for the warmth of his small, hand-built cabin. His remote cabin was several miles from the nearest rough track, nestled deep in the vast, unforgiving wilderness by a freezing creek and surrounded by towering, snow-laden lodgepole pines. He knew this land like the back of his hand, had lived in it for decades, a solitary trapper. But tonight, the familiar path felt longer, more treacherous. The cold was unbearable, the hunger a gnawing beast in his gut. His hip was screaming now, a sharp, searing pain with every step, making him favor his right leg. Every muscle in his body felt heavy, protesting against the relentless demands of the brutal Wyoming winter. He was so close, just a few hundred yards from his cabin's welcoming glow, when his worn boot caught on something hidden beneath a thin dusting of fresh snow. It was an ice-covered rock, slick and unforgiving. His arms flailed uselessly, his balance lost to the fatigue and the pain in his hip. His old lever-action rifle, usually held so tightly, slipped from his numb fingers, burying itself with a soft thud in a nearby snowdrift. A frustrated groan escaped his lips as he crashed down hard, landing awkwardly. The impact sent a fresh wave of agony through his hip, pinning him between a fallen, snow-covered log and the frozen ground. He lay there, winded, his breath coming in ragged gasps, unable to push himself free. Then, from the pristine white stillness, a blur of tawny fur erupted. A large, ravenous male cougar, a formidable hunter, was driven to desperation by the brutal winter's scarcity of prey. It launched itself from a snowdrift, its guttural snarl ripping through the silence, vibrating in the frigid air. Its eyes, twin lamps of pure, unadulterated hunger, were locked on Harold. He could feel the big cat's predatory heat, even before it fully approached, its feral scent thick and overwhelming. Harold tried to scramble, to push himself free, to reach for his rifle, but his body wouldn't obey. His hip screamed in protest with every attempted movement, pinning him further against the log. He was trapped, helpless, watching in frozen terror as the cougar's powerful form coiled, muscles bunching, preparing to pounce. Its breath, hot and heavy, plumed in the freezing air, inches from his face. The hunger in its eyes was palpable, terrifyingly real. This was it, he thought, a life lived hard in the wilderness, ending just as hard, just as brutally. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. The cougar's head lowered, its teeth bared, ready to strike, its powerful paws already shifting for the final deadly spring. Harold squeezed his eyes shut. The feral scent of the cougar thick and overwhelming, a musky, gamey smell that spoke of raw wilderness and sudden death. He could feel the big cat's weight, its predatory heat, even before it touched him. A low, guttural snarl vibrated through the air, inches from his face, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. His old hip screamed, pinned hard against the log, and he knew this was it. His life, lived hard in these mountains, was about to end just as hard. Then, a sound ripped through the cold, biting wind, a deep, resonant howl full of raw authority, echoing through the snow-laden pines. It wasn't the shriek of a cougar, nor the yelp of a coyote, but something far more ancient, more powerful, a sound that seemed to shake the very snow from the branches above. The cougar froze, its head snapping up, ears swiveling, its snarling abruptly cut short by the unexpected intrusion. Moments later, a blur of gray fur erupted from the tree line. It was the pack leader, massive and formidable, its amber eyes burning with an intensity Harold remembered so well, eyes that held a fire he'd not seen since that day a decade ago. Behind it, two other large wolves, dark shadows against the white snow, burst into the clearing, moving with the silent grace of predators. The pack leader, Gray Paw, didn't hesitate for a second. It moved with astonishing speed, a gray streak against the white, planting itself directly between Harold and the cougar. It was a formidable, living barrier, its massive body a shield. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in its chest, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth, filling the frigid air with a defiant challenge. Its hackles rose, making it appear even larger, more imposing. The cougar, taken by surprise, hissed, swiveling its head from the primary threat to the circling shadows. It was a hunter, used to being the undisputed apex predator in its territory. Not the one caught off guard, suddenly outnumbered. Its focus, moments ago solely on Harold, was now divided, its predatory gaze flickering between the lead wolf and its pack members. The two other wolves moved in a coordinated fashion, agile and silent, circling the cougar, nipping at its flanks, harrying the larger cat from behind, forcing it to twist and lash out, never allowing it to fully focus on Gray Paw. Gray Paw, with a ferocity that startled Harold even in his terror, lunged. It wasn't a reckless charge, but a calculated, brutal engagement, a blur of gray fur and powerful jaws. The cougar lashed out instinctively, a lightning-fast rake of its claws. Harold winced as he saw 3 raw, deep claw marks tear across Gray Paw's right flank, instantly blooming dark red, bleeding sluggishly into its thick fur. The cougar's powerful jaws snapped, catching Gray Paw on the shoulder, leaving a fresh, ragged bite mark. But the pack leader held its ground, snarling defiance, its own jaws snapping, driving the cougar back from Harold. The old, faint limp in its left front paw was still there, but in this moment of life and death, it seemed to be a forgotten detail, irrelevant to the wolf's fierce resolve. Every movement, every snarl, every engagement was focused on keeping the cougar away from the pinned man. The relentless, synchronized pressure from the 3 wolves was too much for the cougar. It snarled again, a sound of frustration and fury, but the wolves gave it no quarter, pressing their advantage. Harold, watching in stunned disbelief, realized this was his chance. The cougar's attention was elsewhere, consumed by the unexpected battle. He struggled, pushing against the heavy log, his hips screaming in protest, but adrenaline now coursed through him, lending him a desperate strength. He finally wrestled himself free, scrambling toward where his rifle had fallen, his numb fingers fumbling for the cold metal. The cougar, bleeding and harried, had a choice: continue a losing battle against these determined, unified wolves, or retreat. The cougar, bleeding and harried, had a choice: continue a losing battle against these determined, unified wolves, or retreat. Its snarling turned into a frustrated growl, a sound of fury and disbelief. It slashed once more at one of the circling wolves, narrowly missing, then glanced back at Harold, who was now fumbling with his rifle, trying to load a round into the chamber with his stiff, numb fingers. The human was no longer easy prey. The cougar's eyes, still burning with hunger, weighed the odds. 3 powerful, relentless wolves, and now the old trapper was armed. The calculus of survival was clear. With a final, furious glance that promised future retribution, the cougar broke off the attack. It let out a frustrated huff, a last show of dominance before making its decision. Its powerful hind legs bunched, and in a blur of tawny fur, It bounded away into the deeper, dark timber, disappearing like a ghost among the snow-laden shadows of the lodgepole pines. The sudden silence, broken only by the panting of the wolves and Harold's ragged breaths, was deafening. Harold, his heart hammering against his ribs, finally managed to chamber a round. He held the rifle loosely, its weight suddenly heavy in his hands, his whole body trembling from the cold, the fear, and the sheer, impossible wonder of what he had just witnessed. He watched the last flicker of the cougar disappear. Then slowly, carefully, he turned his gaze to the wolves. The pack leader, Gray Paw, stood its ground, its chest heaving, hot breath steaming in the frigid air. The 3 raw, deep claw marks across its right flank were stark, bleeding sluggishly into its thick gray fur, staining it crimson. The bite on its shoulder glistened darkly, a ragged, fresh wound. The old, faint limp in its left front paw, usually almost imperceptible, was now pronounced, as it clearly favored the injured limb from the brutal strain of the confrontation. It was exhausted, visibly battered, but it stood tall, unwavering, a monument of courage in the fading light. The 2 other wolves stood a respectful distance behind it, watchful, their eyes fixed on their leader, then on Harold. Gray Paw's piercing amber eyes, so familiar, so full of ancient wisdom, met Harold's. In that long, silent moment, a deep, knowing understanding passed between them. Harold, shaken and winded, still tangled in the shock and the lingering terror, felt an overwhelming surge of pride. Not just gratitude, though that was immense, but a profound, almost paternal pride for this magnificent creature he had saved a decade ago. This wasn't just an animal. This was a force of nature, a leader, a protector. "Gray Paw," Harold whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible, a profound relief washing over him. He managed a slow, grateful nod, unable to articulate the depth of his feelings. It was a silent conversation, a debt acknowledged, a life saved. The pack leader watched him for another beat, its chest still heaving, its gaze unwavering. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible nod of its massive head, a gesture Harold felt deep in his soul, it turned. It gathered its 2 pack members with a quiet movement. Then, with a noticeable limp, favoring its front left paw, Gray Paw melted back into the snowy forest, disappearing as silently and mysteriously as it had arrived. They were gone, leaving Harold alone, the stark evidence of the battle. Cougar tracks, wolf tracks, disturbed snow, surrounding him, but undeniably saved. The brutal winter still raged, but Harold felt a warmth in his chest that the fiercest fire couldn't provide. He knew he had just witnessed a miracle, a kindness repaid in the most extraordinary way. The silence that descended after the pack leader vanished was almost heavier than the roar of the cougar. Harold stood, leaning heavily on his retrieved rifle, his body trembling, watching the place where the gray forms had disappeared into the deepening gloom. He was alone, undeniably, utterly alone, but the stark memory of what had just happened, of the wolf's fierce protective presence, lingered like a phantom warmth in the brutal cold. His hip screamed now, a dull, throbbing echo of the earlier, sharper pain. He slowly, deliberately, began to walk towards his cabin, each step a testament to the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. Once inside, he didn't even bother to light his lantern immediately. He just leaned his rifle against the wall and sank onto his rough-hewn stool by the cold hearth, his chest heaving, trying to catch his breath. The raw claw marks on Gray Paw's flank, the bite on its shoulder flashed in his mind. The thought of that brave animal limping back into the unforgiving night left a pang in his heart. He sat there for a long time, letting the shock slowly recede, letting the cabin's familiar silence soothe his jangled nerves. He was alive. He was whole, and it was because of that wolf. Finally, with a weary sigh, he struck a match, and the small cabin sprang to life in the flickering glow of the lantern. He saw his clothes were torn, a rip in his canvas coat where the cougar had brushed against him, leaving a faint, musky scent. He slowly, methodically, got up and lit his small wood stove, the crackle of kindling a comforting sound in the stillness. After sipping some hot water, Harold knew he couldn't just let the night pass. His hand, still trembling slightly, reached for his rifle again. He loaded 3 rounds and stepped back outside, into the biting cold that seemed even more profound now. Aiming for the vast, empty sky above the pines, he fired 3 distress shots, the booming cracks echoing through the canyon, a universal signal in these remote lands. He waited, listened. Nothing but the wind. He fired 3 more, then 3 again, just to be sure. He was letting the world know he was in trouble, or had been. He didn't know if anyone would hear, or if they would even care enough to come. But he had to try. Hours later, long after the moon had risen and begun its slow descent, Harold was drifting into a fitful sleep by the stove when he heard the distant, unmistakable growl of snowmobile engines. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder, cutting through the frosty night. His heart gave a startled jump, then settled into a slow, heavy beat. He stumbled to his cabin door, pulling it open just as 2 snowmobiles, their headlights cutting bright paths through the darkness, pulled up to his cabin. Clifford Weston and Murray Bates, faces grim and bundled in their heavy winter gear, dismounted. "Harold, you all right, old man? We heard shots. Thought for sure a trap had snapped on you," Clifford called out, his voice sharp with concern, unusual for the younger trapper. Murray, older and more weathered, just grunted, his eyes scanning the area, taking everything in. Harold stood pale, his face etched with exhaustion and lingering shock, his clothes torn. "Cougar," he croaked, his voice still hoarse, barely a whisper. "Big one. Ambushed me." Clifford and Murray exchanged quick, skeptical glances. A cougar attack was serious, but Harold had faced plenty in his time. Yet there was something in his eyes. Murray, ever the practical one, walked over to where Harold had fallen. His flashlight beam cut through the snow, illuminating the disturbed area. He knelt, tracing the massive, unmistakable cougar tracks. His flashlight moved, following the tracks, then stopped abruptly. He whistled low. "Well, I'll be," Murray muttered, pointing. Clifford joined him, his jaw dropping. Clearly visible in the snow, alongside the cougar tracks, were the deep, fresh imprints of massive wolf paws, leading directly away from where Harold lay, and not just one set, but 3. "They saved me," Harold managed, his voice stronger now, filled with a raw emotion. "The pack leader, Gray Paw, with 2 others. They drove it off." He recounted the impossible defense, the blur of fur, the ferocity, the blood on Gray Paw's flank. Clifford, who had always scoffed at Harold's softness for saving Gray Paw all those years ago, just stared at the tracks, then at Harold, then back at the tracks. His usual opportunistic swagger was gone, replaced by a stunned silence. Murray, the grizzled old-timer who had dismissed Harold's act of kindness as folly, simply stood, his practical eyes taking in every detail. He looked from the cougar tracks to the wolf tracks, to the small, faint depression in the snow where Harold had been pinned. He saw the evidence of a desperate attack and the undeniable intervention of the wolf pack. His skepticism, once so resolute, was shattered. He glanced at Clifford, a profound, grudging respect dawning slowly in his weathered eyes. Neither man said a word, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Weeks melted into a cold, unbroken stretch of winter. Harold Finch's hip slowly mended, the deep ache dulling to a familiar throb. But the memory of that brutal night, of the cougar and the wolves, remained as sharp as the mountain air. He often thought of Gray Paw, of the blood on its flank, the bite on its shoulder, and worried. A wild animal, wounded, faced an even harder fight for survival in the deep winter. But the wilderness, as it always did, eventually offered its own quiet reassurances. A few weeks after the attack, Harold was out gathering firewood, moving slower than usual when he saw them. The pack. Moving silently through the fresh snow, a line of gray against the white. And at the head, unmistakable, was the pack leader. Gray Paw. It still had a noticeable limp, favoring that front left paw, and the fur on its right flank was matted, showing where the wounds had been, but it was moving with purpose, leading its family. Its head was held high, its amber eyes keen and alert, scanning the tree line for any sign of prey. Harold watched from a distance, hidden behind a thick stand of pines, a profound sense of relief washing over him. The king of this domain was recovering, surviving, thriving. The debt had been paid, and life, in its relentless, beautiful way, was continuing. About a month after the incident, Harold was sitting by his fire, carving a new handle for a trap, when he heard the familiar rumble of snowmobiles. He knew it was Clifford Weston and Murray Bates before they even pulled up to his cabin. They didn't burst in like before, full of questions and thinly veiled skepticism. This time they knocked. Harold opened the door to find them standing there, a rare sight for a casual visit. Clifford had a respectful, almost subdued look on his face. Murray, his grizzled features softened slightly, held out a small sack. "Harold," Murray began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Brought you some supplies from town. Thought you might be running low." He gestured vaguely at the cabin. "And, just wanted to check on you." Clifford nodded, avoiding Harold's direct gaze for a moment. "Yeah, Harold. That cougar. Heard it was a nasty one. You were lucky." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "About those wolves." Harold just looked at them, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. He invited them in, and they settled awkwardly by the fire, accepting mugs of strong black coffee. The usual banter, the subtle jabs about Harold's softness or his eccentric ways, were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was a quiet, almost reverent atmosphere. Murray finally broke the silence, swirling his coffee. "Saw some tracks, Harold, out near the North Ridge a few days back. Big ones. And, yeah, one of them had a bit of a drag to it, just like you said." He looked up, his eyes meeting Harold's, a flicker of something new in their depths. "Never thought I'd see the day a wolf." He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. Clifford, who had been listening intently, finally spoke, his voice low. "I always thought you were just soft, Harold. You know, for letting that wolf go. Waste of good pelts, but, well, I guess some things ain't always what they seem." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable with expressing such a profound change of heart, but the sincerity was unmistakable. Harold took a long sip of his coffee, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. He looked out the window, at the vast, snow-covered expanse, knowing that somewhere out there, Gray Paw, the pack leader, was leading its life, strong and free. "Out here," Harold said softly, his gaze still fixed on the wilderness, "we think we know how things work. We put a price on everything, decide what's useful and what ain't. But sometimes, kindness ain't useless. Sometimes it's the strongest thing there is. And the wilderness, it remembers." He turned to face them, his old eyes clear and full of an ancient wisdom. "Sometimes The ones you write off? The ones nobody else wants? They're the ones that remember you, too. Murray and Clifford sat in silence, contemplating his words, the fire crackling softly between them. The wilderness outside continued its silent vigil, vast and unyielding. But for a moment, in Harold Finch's cabin, a different kind of truth had found its warmth. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.